Why do we both import and export beef? And, there's sort of two parts to that. One is, don't we produce enough beef in the U.S. for our own market? And of course, in total, we do. But again, we get that set of products. So the set of products that we produce with the set of animals that we produce doesn't exactly match what our preferences are for products. And so, as we've already talked about, there's products that we value less in the U.S. And many times those have more value in an export market. There's products that we value in the U.S. that we don't produce enough of that stuff, and so we import. And so it's not a straightforward thing.
Welcome to the Beef Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Brandy Buzzard, and it's my pleasure to bring you the latest trends and issues from the best and brightest minds in the beef industry. I am so excited for this episode today because we are joined by Dr. Derrell Peel, Breedlove Professor of Agribusiness and Extension Livestock Marketing Specialist at Oklahoma State University. I have long followed and respected Dr. Peel's work and insight on ag economics, specifically the cattle markets, and I've been really looking forward to this episode since it showed up on the schedule. So with that, let's dive right in. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Peel. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here today.
Yeah, like I said, I'm very excited to have you on here. We have met via email a few times. We were talking about that before we started, but have never actually, I guess we can count this as in person, but it's nice to speak with you face to face today.
Yeah, you bet.
Well, to start off with, for those people who have not been constantly following your work like I have maybe, so could you maybe bring us up to speed on your background and your career, how you got started in the beef and cattle industry, and just kind of what brought you to where you are now?
Well, let me work backwards, I guess. I've been at Oklahoma State University. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Agricultural Economics. I just passed my 35-year anniversary in this position. So
wow,
I've been here quite a while.
Congratulations.
So that covers the bulk of it. Prior to that, there was I moved around a bit, worked for a number of universities in various capacities, either as a grad student or in various other capacities. And so I've been around the cattle industry all my life. I grew up on a small cattle and hay operation, basically in western Montana. And so, I've been involved in the cattle industry since the very beginning.
So you left Montana and haven't gone back. You just stayed there in Oklahoma.
I've been in Oklahoma a long time now, so I've lived here longer than anywhere else. And like I said, I did live a number of other places along the way. And kind of in those early career things, we moved around a bit around the country. And so, yeah, but I've been here a long time now.
I have a degree, undergraduate degree, a bachelor's in ag economics from Kansas State University, which I have not used since I walked across the stage and got it. But I can only imagine that, and this is a question, like that the practices and the work and the studies had to have changed from when you were going through your undergraduate and master's and PhD to now. Like, I'm just curious because I don't often speak to someone who's been a professor for 35 years at the same place, right? And it's not me poking fun at you. I just, how is it different now than it was when you were going through school? Are the teaching methods different? This isn't what we were planning to talk about today, but I just want to ask this one question and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, well, of course, economic theory hasn't changed in the last couple of 100 years. So, the basic economic principles are the same. The way we approach it, as far as teaching is a little different now, just mainly based on technology changes and other things. But, for me, probably the biggest changes relative to when I started my career is just the way the beef industry has changed so much. I've had to continue to expand my my areas of study a bit. And, I consider myself a student of the industry and of markets broadly. I learn something every day if I just remember to pay attention. And so, it's an incredibly complex industry, and it seems like it's a lot more complex now than it was then. I think I'm just learning more about it. But it is getting, a little bit more developed when you throw in the way markets have expanded, international trade, and so on. one example real quick is that, when I started, we thought of beef demand in fairly simplistic terms. So if you remember that undergraduate class, and I bet you have used your undergraduate degree more than you want to admit, but if you remember those price quantity demand curves that we draw in class, that's the way we characterize beef demand mostly, was just kind of a simple aggregate. Beef is one thing, and there's price and quantity. Well, now it's become very obvious that we have to think about beef in much more specific terms. We produce thousands of different products in this industry,
Mm-hmm.
and every one of them is a separate market. And so to really understand beef demand, you have to disaggregate that big quantity variable into a lot of different products that go into different markets in the US, as well as into a multitude of different markets around the world. And so that's just one example of how my work has continued to expand. I find myself in the last 20 years or so learning enough. I'm going to say it this way: I've learned enough meat science to be dangerous, because I've had to learn a lot about where the products come from, what the trade-offs are, and how we fabricate carcasses, and the quality stuff and all of that stuff. So that's just one example of how things have changed and how we've had to continue to develop a bigger and bigger perspective on this industry.
You bring up a really interesting, but also like a natural point there. You're talking about, when beef is marketed, it's not just marketed as all right, the animal's been slaughtered and here's a side of beef, sell it. Like, it's broken
Exactly.
down. And I have I've learned more about global trade and in the last probably 5 years than I did in undergraduate. And that's not the fault of my professors. Please, Dr. Barkley at K-State, please don't. I hope he doesn't hear this and call me and say, what are you saying? I've just, now that I'm in, like, or we raise beef, we market beef, like, it's applicable now. So I understand it more. But I think that's something that is missing from a lot of people maybe don't understand, is that it's not just, okay, here's a side of beef, market it. Like, there's stuff that you really use here in the United States that we get a lot of value from export. So maybe you could speak just a little bit about international trade and global trade. Just was the same thing, but just what your perspective on those, and maybe how the current market is affecting those things for producers and the beef industry as a whole.
Yeah, that's another dimension, of course, that has grown tremendously. When I started a long time ago, international trade was relatively minor component. We didn't talk about it a lot. We knew that we exported, some of the edible offals and things, so livers and tongues and things. But it's developed into a much bigger deal now with both the, bilateral trade. So we import beef. There's reasons why, economic reasons why that is. We export products, but again, it's very product specific, as you mentioned, and so it all interacts with the domestic market, and so as you said, there's things that we don't eat as much, but yet we get a whole set of products from every animal.
Yeah.
Now we do have some ability to control within some range what those products are. We can fabricate these carcasses different ways,
Mm-hmm.
but the fact of the matter is you're going to get chucks and rounds and ribs and loins from every carcass, and so you're going to get that basic set of products. I like to remind producers, when you think about the value of trade, when a lot of producers do produce their own beef and they put beef in the freezer at home. And when you think about it, when you get down kind of towards the end, there's always those pieces in the bottom that you haven't gotten to yet, right?
Yes.
And the good steaks are gone, and maybe you're getting low on ground beef. So we start talking about, getting another animal in the freezer, and somebody in the house is going to say, yeah, but we got to eat the rest of that stuff that's in the bottom of the freezer before we put more on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
Those pieces are the kind of thing that actually help the industry. If you think about it broadly in the US, we export some of that stuff. And when we export it, it means that we don't detract from what we eat in the US. So exports not only have value because there's a higher market in some other place in the world, but we also, if we produce it, we're going to eat it. Somebody's going to eat it somewhere, right? It's all perishable.
Yes.
And so, if it's still here, it will get eaten at some value, but that value will be less than what we would actually be willing to spend on the stuff we really like to eat. So there's a lot of interaction at a product specific level between the domestic market and domestic demand. and international trade. And again, it's relative to both imports and exports.
I was smiling when you were talking about the freezer example, because for us, we love roast. So there's never roast at the bottom of our freezer. There's obviously no steak or ground beef. But for us, it's always the short ribs are at the bottom. Like, we sell a significant amount of freezer beef,
Right.
or I think it's significant. And I just picked up a quarter, our quarter, that we hadn't gotten one in several months. And I was looking at the bottom of the freezer and I was like, dang it, those short ribs are still there. We really got to do something with those. But you're exactly right. Like, even people who are beef enthusiasts and like raise our own beef, like, there's still those things that we view as not value, but like lesser value. And
exactly. And that's, yeah, we will eat them at some value, but they're going to be the last choice. And
yeah,
and it turns out that, short ribs is a great example. South Korea is a market that highly values beef short ribs.
mm-hmm.
And so we export a tremendous amount to them. And that's great because that adds value to that product when we ship it there. It also means that we don't detract from what you would rather be eating here and spending money on as a consumer in the U.S. by eating those short ribs that are here if we didn't have a place to go with it.
If there was a way for me to market the package of short ribs off of my own personal quarter to South Korea, I would do that. But that's given me idea. We have flag football for my 7-year-old tonight, and I want us to eat dinner before we go. And so I think I will look up some sort of like Korean beef dish to do this. So I so appreciate you saying that, because I would not have thought to go that route with it. I was just been like, I'll let my husband cook those one night when I'm on a business trip or something. So
yeah, exactly.
When we're talking about global trade, this is a very contentious issue in the beef industry. I don't believe that it should be, but importing beef can be a very contentious issue depending on who you're talking to. So I'm hoping that you can share with us like these kind of 3 pieces of information. So I didn't give you any heads up on these, but I'm sure that you know these numbers. So what is the average amount of percentage of the beef consumed in the US that's kind of like imported every year? What do we import mostly? Like, if there's one big group of cuts or something like that. And then what are we exporting? And I just think that, not everybody is aware of those things. And I think that there's a lot of value to you actually verbalizing those and putting them out on the internet.
Yeah, you bet. I get this question I have for many, many years. Why do we both import and export beef? And, there's sort of 2 parts to that. One is, don't we produce enough beef in the U.S. for our own market? And of course, in total, we do. But again, we get that set of products. So the set of products that we produce with the set of animals that we produce doesn't exactly match what our preferences are for products. And so, as we've already talked about, there's products that we value less in the U.S. And many times those have more value in an export market. There's products that we value in the U.S. that we don't produce enough of that stuff, and so we import. And so it's not a straightforward thing to, sometimes people perceive that all imports are detracting from U.S. markets, and actually that's not true, because much of what we import is processing beef, lean beef, or think of it as stuff that's going to go into ground beef. At least a whole bunch of it does. And so, and we love our hamburgers in the U.S.
Yes, we do.
40 to 50% of our beef consumption in the U.S. is in the form of ground beef. And we use lean and we use fat trimmings from our fed cattle to make that lean beef. And the bottom line is, we don't produce enough lean from our cull cows and bulls to utilize all of the fattier trimmings that come from our fed cattle that would turn it into ground beef. So we have a deficit of lean beef production. And the cheapest, most economical place to get that is from somewhere else in the world where they do produce more of that kind of product. Now, could we do it in the U.S.? Yeah, we could, but we would actually have to take products that have a higher value in the U.S. and either not produce them the same way, produce them to a lower value, or we would take products that have a higher value and grind them down into ground beef prices when they actually have value as muscle cuts in either in the U.S. or in some export market. So the bottom line is that both exports and imports actually add value to the U.S. industry.
I will be go ahead.
That kind of blows people's mind a little bit, but it all comes back to the fact that what the market is doing when we trade both imports and exports, is we're really just maximizing the total amount of value in the system by finding the best place to either source or to ship to when we conduct trade in the beef industry.
You'll have to pry the ribeye from my cold dead hands before you're going to grind it into a hamburger on one of our animals. So, or for us at least. I mean, someone buys
Yeah, sure.
do that, but
it doesn't make sense, right? We wouldn't want to do that. And so, again, if it's markets work at all levels, whether it's local markets, you trade with people because it's a net value to both. Markets are not a zero sum game. They add net value when they work like they're supposed to, and like they should. There's an increase in value when you trade. And that's true whether it's at the local level, whether it's within the U.S. or whether it's within global markets. The same economic principles apply at all levels. There's nothing really unique about international trade. It's just that sometimes we get a little bit hung up with the fact that there's a different color flag flying over some of these markets, and we want to make that a bigger deal maybe than it should be from an economic standpoint.
Very well said. And just put you right on the spot here. What is the cattle market going to do in 2025?
Well, so I often joke with people that one of the secrets to staying a livestock marketing analyst for over 30 years is that I will give you a price or a date, but never both in the same sentence. So, and that's a nice way of saying that, of course, nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. And so I can't be terribly specific because I don't like being wrong that much. Yeah. But at the same time, when you look at the general condition, we're in a very, very unique situation. Now, I've never not known cattle markets to be dynamic and interesting. There's always something going on. And it's, collectively, the cattle and beef industry is probably the most complex set of markets on the planet. So there's a lot of things going on at all times. But that said, I would say that we're in probably one of the more unique situations that I've ever seen in my career, just in terms of where we find ourselves on the supply side with cattle inventories and our production that's coming, that's going to happen, that we're going to deal with in the next couple of years, combined with the demand we're seeing, the international trade components. So I say all that to say that we're in multi-decade lows in cattle numbers. That means that beef production is going to decline. Certainly that will be true through 2025 and beyond. And that means that while we're at nearly record prices across the board for cattle and beef, we're likely to go higher as we go forward through 2025 and again, probably beyond, because we're in a situation now where we're kind of in a hole. We didn't plan to be here, but because of drought and other things, we find ourselves in this situation. And it's the uniqueness this time compared to some previous times is that we don't have the ability to change that very fast. Mm-hmm. We will eventually change it, I think. We will increase production. We will rebuild the herd. We will produce our way back into lower cattle prices because that's the way markets work. But that's going to take more time this time than we've ever seen.
So what your impression of so thank you for that. And I knew that I wasn't trying to put you on a gotcha spot. I knew that was going to be a complex answer. So I wasn't expecting a finite answer, but you kind of just, the way you described your role almost sounded like a meteorologist that you didn't want to commit too much because you're afraid of it not working out the way. So I can understand why you don't want to say specifically.
Well, if you ask me exactly how high our price is going to be or what our price is going to be on a certain date next year, no, I don't know that.
Oh, and yeah.
But in terms of the general trends, yeah, I'm pretty comfortable. And frankly, as a market analyst, given that I know how economics and markets work, for me to say that we're at nearly record prices and we're going to go even higher is a pretty scary statement because that won't be true indefinitely. Someday that won't be true, but I think it's going to be true certainly through the next couple of years.
As a cow-calf producer, that is very encouraging to me to hear.
It is.
So you touched on this a little bit. When is your impression? Because we have, fortunately, where I'm at in Southeast Kansas, we have had a very ample amount of moisture through the summer, which you normally don't get, and been very grateful for that. Unfortunately, other regions of the United States in cattle country have not been as fortunate. So I'm not trying to rub that in anybody's faces. But what is your impression of when maybe like, and again, I know you can't predict the weather, but are we starting to see herd rebuilding right now? Are we still in a decline of the national cow herd? Kind of when do you predict a trend of when we see people retaining more of those heifers to start building back?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question broadly that everybody's asking in the industry, has been for some time. And I think we will be for a while because, there's sort of two parts to that. One is you sort of what do we have to do? That's kind of the drought, the mother nature side of this thing. What are we forced to do? That's why we got here. We didn't plan to be this small in terms of cattle numbers. We're smaller than we need to be. We're smaller than we intended to be, but here we are.
Right.
And going forward, so that'll be one question. And I can't predict the weather. That would help. I'd still probably weasel on my economic forecast, but if I at least knew the weather for sure, that would make it easier. And I think that's a very real question. The meteorologist been telling us for several months that we were going to transition back into La Nina kind of weather conditions for parts of the U.S. That implies a likelihood that we have warmer and drier than normal conditions. And so given that we've never really gotten out of drought in some areas, and a lot of producers, in terms of their resources, are still trying to heal up and recover. And now they're looking at, well, the potential, or at least a higher probability, that we're going to revert back into some level of drought. So I think that's one factor that's limiting, producers' expectations about and their plans about how aggressive they might want to be of trying to rebuild the herd. They're down to where they are. If they still have, or whatever number of animals they still have now because of the drought conditions we've had, they're probably kind of holding steady in many cases until we get some sense that we, have the physical ability to be bigger. And so I think that's one factor. The other part of it is sort of the producer expectations. What do producers want to do? If drought was not an issue, would producers want to expand? And I think even that one's in question at this point. Now, markets usually solve that problem by raising prices. So we've got nearly record high calf prices. And the market is really focused on the calf level right now because that's how you stimulate more cow herds rebuilding, to offer higher calf prices. I think the market is doing that, but I don't think, all else being equal, I'm not sure it's enough yet that producers are going to be very aggressive about rebuilding the herd. So, and there's a variety of reasons for that. Financial conditions are a lot different now than they were, say, 10 years ago, the last time we were in a somewhat similar market situation. Obviously, interest rates are higher, although we did just have a rate cut. That's going to help over time a little bit. But just in general, cost of production is still relatively high. And so, producers sometimes tell me, yeah, calf prices are high, but they're just not high enough yet. And I believe that. But my response to that is, well, then I suspect that the market will continue to offer even higher prices until it is high enough.
Right.
Because the market is going to keep providing those incentives until we respond, because I think the market clearly wants us to be bigger than we are. And that means we got to rebuild this herd. So I don't think it's happening yet. Based on the data we have available, I don't see any indication that we're doing it yet. And I think, for the whole year, when we get the inventory numbers for January 1 of 2025, I'm pretty sure the beef cow herd is going to be smaller than it was even this last year.
Really?
Now, will it stabilize in 2025? Maybe. Could be plus or minus, but I don't think it's going to change a great deal in 2025. It'll be plus or minus unchanged. And then, if we save heifer calves this fall, then we could potentially see some growth in the herd by 2026, but really not before that, right?
I mean, that's early. Yeah, that's early.
The biology is a reality here. So if we save a heifer calf this fall, we could breed her next year. She'll have a calf in 2026. And really, it'd be 2027 before we would start seeing any increase in beef production.
Yeah.
And that assumes that we save heifer calves this fall, and I don't know that we're doing that or that we're going to do it here in the next couple of months.
It's interesting when I talk to people who are involved in like other segments of agriculture, who maybe don't have cattle or something like that, or they have pigs or something. It's just, I understand. It's just remarkable to me. Like we can't turn the ship very quickly in the beef industry. Like we have this very small rudder on like a cruise ship, and we can only manage so much of what's happening. Like we can't manage the weather, and we obviously can't speed up biology. And so we're just
Yeah.
managing what we can. Someone who runs stockers and right now, and maybe they're trying to decide, am I going to ship those to the feed yard and retain ownership? Or am I just going to sell them through like an order buyer or an auction yard or something like that? What do you think of those two options? What is your opinion of those two options? Go to feed yard, retain ownership, or just market through the best option, whether that be an order buyer, an auction yard, etc.
We just said that the market's kind of focused on the cow-calf level right now because that's where we're short in numbers. We need to rebuild the herd. So the market focus is there. And what has happened, if you look at a price chart, and it always happens in this kind of a situation, is that the price for calves goes up faster and farther than feeder cattle.
Mm-hmm.
And the price for feeder cattle at the next level up goes up farther and faster than fed cattle. And so on. And so basically what that implies is that everybody above the cow-calf level, as you know, are margin operations. It's all about that buy-sell spread. Yeah, obviously other costs of production are important too, but for every segment above the cow-calf level, it's pretty much a question of that buy-sell margin. And so those margins in general get squeezed in this kind of a market environment. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you can't do any of that stuff, but in general, the market is not, the market's not really encouraging cow-calf producers to retain ownership of their calves through the stocker phase or even into the feedlot, simply because the market's telling us we need cows and calves. Your grass has the most value with the most number of calves you can produce. So if you have a choice of devoting some of that forage for stocker production or retaining your calves through stockers, now the market's not really encouraging that in general right now. Now, if you're a stocker producer, you've got a challenge. Numbers are not very high, so it's hard to find cattle.
Mm-hmm.
The ones you buy are very expensive relative to the ones you sell in general, although there's a time lag. And so, and then same's true for a feedlot, feedlots are in a unique situation right now. They're trying to maintain inventories because they've got a feed plant, they've got capacity, and yet cattle numbers don't favor that. So they're scrambling in all sorts of ways to try to maintain inventory and to maintain their margins. And it's an increasing challenge in this environment. So, while the cow-calf producer is kind of enjoying high prices and more profit opportunities, and I think they will for some time, these other sectors are going to have a lot more challenges to make their margins work in general. Now, that doesn't mean it can't work at all, but I think it just means everybody's got to have a pretty sharp pencil to figure out the timing and sort of the nuances of how to make these things work in this environment.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I think it's important because there's a certain amount of risk involved for each level that you're keeping those. That there's a risk involved with sending them to the feed yard. A plant could, never would wish this, but a plant could start on fire or something like that. And then all these things happen. And so I just think it's good for people to understand all the different facets and things that play in to some of these decisions. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but you were talking about producers saying that like the market wasn't high enough yet, maybe for retention or something like that. I guess I want to go back to that. What are you hearing from producers about maybe their general feeling for the coming months and years? Like, or is there general optimism? Is there general pessimism? Is it about equal on both sides? What are you hearing?
Yeah, well, and again, I think that's the key to those expectations that will drive producer decisions. And I guess what I see so far, and some of this is really kind of a logical aftermath of, again, about 10 years ago, we had a drought. We got smaller than we intended to be. We saw very high prices at that time. We've since gone higher, but that lasted about 2 years. It didn't take us long to produce our way back into lower prices in 2014, 2015. And I think producers remember that. And so they look at the situation now. We've been through a lot of hardship with drought and in many cases, extra expenses and so on. And so their attitude is really twofold. First of all, I need to heal up financially.
Mm-hmm.
So we're taking advantage of these higher prices that we've had to sell pretty much everything, not keeping any heifers back maybe or less than usual. And the other part is some skepticism that this will continue very long into the future. We've already had 2 years of pretty good prices.
Yeah.
And, some producers are like, well, okay, that was good. It might be about over. So I'm just not going to really step out there and commit to, that longer term investment in retaining those heifers.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that. I understand that. What I'm saying is that I think it is going to last longer this time. I think that's one of the key differences now compared to what happened about a decade ago, is that we're in a very unique situation where we will stay on a higher level of prices for an extended period of time. So, and the longer we don't reinvest in the herd and rebuild the herd, the more that's going to be true,
Yeah.
right?
It goes out
So
further.
it becomes a self-fulfilling thing the longer. And so, but eventually, I think producers will say, wow, I better get in on this. I need to keep some more heifers. And I don't think it's happening yet. I think producers are. So to answer your question about producer attitudes, I think producers are pretty happy about markets where they are today.
Right.
But I think they're a little bit skeptical about the longer term picture at this point. That's maybe keeping them from even attempting to be very aggressive. All the more so because of the drought stuff we talked about, and the threats of redeveloping drought issues
Right.
means that I don't want to get committed to a bunch of animals and then have to sell them anyway, simply because I can't take care of them or can't feed them.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I know, where I'm at, there's both. I hear people who are obviously happy with the way that prices are going. And then I hear people who are, trying to analyze the future and decide, like, is it worth it? There's a hesitancy, there's a lot of risk. And so I hear from both sides. So I wanted to hear your outlook there as well.
I think there's a little difference between the long run and the short run perspectives here. Short run, we're happy about it, but long run, we're a little skeptical. So we're just kind of focusing on the short run, taking advantage of the market as it is today.
Yeah. Living in the present.
Exactly.
Okay. If you could give one piece of advice for producers as they look to the next, well, I won't say 18 months, but the next year here of production, what would that piece of advice be for the average cow-calf producer? I'll narrow it down there.
For cow-calf producers, and this is going to be true always. I mean, the current market notwithstanding, but in general, cow-calf producers are not really in the cattle business. They're in the grass business. In fact,
yes,
pretty much everybody in the cattle industry is in some form of the feed business. And so I say that to say, as a cow-calf producer, I think at all times, if you will ask yourself, where does my forage, my grass, have the most value? What form? I get to market that grass either as a wean calf, as a retained stocker, and sometimes we even have other options. It might be hay, it might be hunting leases, it might be any number of things. And so if you'll ask yourself, where does my forage have the most value in the current market conditions, I think you'll generally make better decisions about that, and it will change over time. That's the other thing about the cattle industry, is that the answers change. The questions are kind of always the same, but the answers change.
Right.
And so, that's kind of been my experience as an analyst. Every time I get something figured out, it don't stay figured out, because you've constantly got to reanalyze the situation. So, but that's the basis for the industry. I think ultimately, and you didn't really ask this, but I will say this, that I think ultimately the only thing that really ensures that we're going to have a cattle industry in this country is the fact that cows eat grass.
That's fair.
And that grazing is what gives us a competitive advantage and a comparative advantage relative to other protein sources, relative to other use of those land resources, and so on. As long as cows eat grass, then I think we're going to have a market for something to utilize that grass, and that's the basis for the industry.
That's a great little soundbite there. That was wonderful. I was thinking, you were saying that the questions are the same, but the answers change. That's not a class that you want to take in college, a class where the questions stay the same from year to year, but the answers are changing. You're not studying your friend's test that took the class last semester.
It's time for our famous three.
I do have the same questions that we ask every guest at the end of the episode. So I want to go into those now. And our audience who might not have had many episodes under your belt, we do ask these same questions. And I did give Dr. Peel a heads up on these. So I'm not just rapid firing them with no warning. So the first one is, what is your favorite beef or cattle related resource?
Well, for me, as an analyst, obviously, and as an economist, we use tremendous amounts of data. There's an organization called the Livestock Marketing Information Center.
Mm-hmm.
It's lmic.info, and it's really intended to be kind of a backstop to people like me. It's a place where they keep a lot of data. They help us do what we do because there is just an enormous amount of data. I use that resource a lot. There is a public part of that, but by and large, producers will get access to that information through analysts like me.
Yeah.
Many state extension services are members of the LMIC. There's 27 or 8 states around the country that are members of that. So that's how you tap that information, is through your extension services and the information they provide. But for me, that's probably my biggest resource.
Well, that's great. I do value. I thought, like I've said earlier, I have followed you for a while, and I read your articles when they come out in drovers, and there's always very valuable information in there. So, and no doubt you're getting some of that from LMIC. And I've never had anybody say that resource before. You're the first person to name that one. So, thank you for sharing that. The next one is, what is your favorite non-beef or cattle related book, or a non-beef or cattle related book that you're reading right now?
I don't know if I've read a nonfiction book in about 5 or 6 years. It seems like I never have time. I have lots of interests, so I'm kind of a history buff, and so a lot of that ties back into whether it's history of the cattle industry or whatever, but just history in general. So I'm not going to give you a specific book at the moment because I'm actually not reading anything right at the moment, but in general, that's probably what I would read if I were going to take time and be able to get away from this stuff a little bit. It would be some sort of history. Again, whether it's cattle or agricultural industry history, or just history more broadly, that's where I tend to go for, kind of on the side.
Do you like historical fiction or historical nonfiction, like biographical history, or history that pull pieces of it to tell a story? And
Yeah, I'm pretty rooted in nonfiction, I think, much to my wife's chagrin. So she's the fiction reader. I'm kind of the nonfiction reader for the most part. So
okay.
yeah, so it would be nonfiction history in most cases.
All right, and then the last one is, when you think of someone that you admire or look up to, what is a characteristic that person possesses that has led them to be successful?
So you didn't ask me who that was, and there's probably a handful of people that I would draw pieces from, but and there's there's lots of traits that are important and so on. But I guess I'm going to say it this way, because I think for me, I said this earlier, that I'm a student of the industry. I think the key is to always keep learning. There's so much to learn, and it's not that we're going to have it all figured out. The world's too complex, but I think we keep learning, we keep progressing, and again, you see things every day. I look at what I think I understand now about the cattle industry, and it seems a tremendous amount more than when I started 35 years ago. At the same time, what I know more than anything else is to appreciate how much of it we still don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the key, is to just keep learning every day.
We always hear people say that you learn something every day, but you have to pay attention to learn those things. And so I like that added bit that you said, that you learn something every day if you just pay attention. I think that's an important part of it.
It's not a completely passive process. You have to sort of be committed to learning and sort of recognize it. If you're not careful, new stuff will present itself and you just ignore it and move on. And, so you got to pay attention a little bit.
Yeah. I think that's a really important piece of it. It's not just, I guess we are sponges, but like, you have to be willing to accept the information. So, Dr. Peel, that is all the questions and time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. I have so thoroughly enjoyed this episode. I could talk to you for another 45 minutes, and I'm afraid that we would lose people though with another full hour. But thank you so much for joining us today. If people have questions for you, want to learn more about ag economics or livestock marketing specifically, or the cattle markets, where can they do that? Is there somewhere you'd like to send them to?
There's several places. I mean, we've got beefextension.com, I believe, gets you to the OSU kind of beef team website, or web pages and information. But I'm pretty easy to find. So Derrell.Peel at okstate.edu is my email. And I get lots of them, so it's a little hard to stay on top of them sometimes. But I'm happy to interact with anybody if they have questions or comments for me.
Thank you again, Dr. Peel, for joining us. I just can't say that enough. And then also thank you for our audience for being here, and then for tuning in. And we'll meet you back here next week on the Beef Podcast.
You bet.